Oh, okay.
Sorry, I know you were waiting for me.
Alright, so my name is Grant Gerard, and my topic is based on measuring the relative effects of general or vocational education on employment. So first off, before I continue, I'm going to go through the outline of what the rest of my presentation is going to look like. So first off, I'm going to look at the background of my presentation, sort of more specifically what my question is grounded in, and also the importance of looking at this topic. Next, I'll be looking at the literature, what my topic is based in, what past research has found, and the theory of human capital, which is my main theory. After that, I'll be looking at the theoretical and empirical frameworks, so sort of the base of my theory and my empirical work. After that, I'll be looking at my data, sort of some manipulations that I did with my data, and some descriptive statistics. After that, I'll be looking at my results and conclusions. So first off, with my background, I think it's very important that I outline the difference between general and vocational education. So vocational education has been defined as an education which prepares a student for one occupation or very few occupations, for very specific sort of education. Whereas general education is something like a university degree which prepares students for a broad range or a broad attitude of different vocations or occupations. So more specifically into my topic, I looked at cross-country analysis of whether vocational education grants initial employment gains over that of general education, but then throughout a person's work life cycle or as they increase in age, I found that general education then switches over with vocational education around the age of 45, give or take a couple years. Now why I think this is very important is first off, employment has tangible and intangible reasons and impacts. So tangible reasons, very obviously, if you are employed, you have income, you're part of the economy, you can support yourself and potentially a family. And then intangible impacts, some things discussed in previous classwork, is if you are employed, that lifelong career allows you to be a part of a peer group and may increase general happiness. Also, education reform is one of the largest topics of debate currently in our political landscape and economy. But whether purposefully or accidentally, vocational education is often left out of this conversation, and what is discussed is the subsidization of a general education. And if vocational education does indeed grant those initial benefits over that of general education, I can't seem to understand why it's left out of that topic. So a little bit about the literature. First off, Becker, along with a couple other researchers, were a major part of developing the theory of human capital. And what Becker theorized is that anything increasing your relative income potentials is human capital. So this isn't only education, but can be on-the-job training and even go as far as nutrition. Next is the Cairo-Kajner paper. This paper really analyzed the effects of on-the-job training and how human capital affects entry and exit into employment. After my next two is really the basis and fundamental papers for my topic. The Hanishek, Schwartz, Wolfson, and Zhang paper really created the foundation to cross-country analyze vocational versus general education. I was unable to use the data from the Hanishek papers, which leads me to the Hanfin-Wolfson paper, which outlined the PIAC data, which is the data that I use, as well as certain variables and ways to manipulate this data. So first off with my theoretical framework, the three equations created by Becker. The first one, wage equaling marginal productivity. So essentially in a perfect market, your wage is equal to exactly what your productivity. Now assuming that the higher marginal productivity, the higher your employability, brings us to a problem which Becker realized, that if doing on-the-job training or education was free, there'd be no actual business being done. It would all be about employees increasing their marginal productivity and their human capital. Which brings us to equation number 2, where wage equals potential marginal productivity, less K. So K is a direct cost associated with training, which is then placed upon the employee. Now that is on-the-job training, which brings us to equation 3, to answer the question of education. So wage equals potential marginal productivity less C, which is your direct and indirect costs associated with education. Direct costs being tuition, books, anything directly out of pocket to pay for education. Indirect cost is that of foregone income. So while you are getting your general education, you are out of the workforce for approximately 4 years and losing that income which you could have gained while being in the marketplace. This is explained in the graphical representation: general in blue, vocational in black, high school in orange. As you can see, earnings or marginal productivity is on the y-axis and age is on the x-axis. So as you can see, general education begins far lower than that of vocational and high school, mostly due to the much larger direct and indirect costs associated with general education. But then as you can see, as an individual increases in age or their work life, general education should cross over with that of a vocational education. All right, so for my empirical framework, I was unable to run a OLS regression model due to the fact that my dependent variable, or employment, is a limited dependent variable, meaning it is within the bounds of 0 and or 1. So essentially you are a 0 unemployed or 1 employed. I was unable to run the OLS, which is why I had to run the linear probability model, which does its best to keep the bounds at 0 and 1. Which brings me to my predicted signs. So essentially what this is some of the most important descriptive statistics and how I believe they will impact employment. As you can see, all of my signs are positives besides age times vocational education. To discuss this a little further, I believe vocational education, obviously in line with theory, should increase your employability. Next years of schooling, literacy score, numeracy score are all signs of general intelligence, as I believe would increase your marginal productivity, increasing employment. Father education, mother education is a good tell of educational background within the family, which it should be a positive trend. And then finally, age interacted with vocational education. As I stated before, I believe that as an individual increases in age and they also have a vocational education, I believe this could lead to a negative correlation, or negative influence, I mean. My empirical framework continued. So as you can see, this is my regression equation with my employment I. This also, just to expand further on that, it's employed in the last week in paid work. I left that out on accident. But as you can see, a bunch of my variables are in the equation. Most importantly is my second to last variable, which is a dummy variable, accounting for country-specific effects. Because as I stated before, I'm doing a cross-country analysis, and it's very important that one country does not demand or does not take over the analysis more than others. For example, I'm looking at France, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, and then the Czech Republic. The Czech Republic has much higher unemployment rates and has slightly less development than some of the other Northern and Western European countries. So I think it was important to account for these differences. As for my data, I'm looking at the PIAC data, as mentioned before, for the Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies. This survey looked at adults' proficiency in key processing skills. So a couple of those include, as you saw before, the numeracy and literacy scores, but also omitted from my analysis was the problem-solving skills. Looking at 40 different countries, individuals were surveyed between the ages of 16 and 65, and approximately 5,000 individuals were surveyed from each country. Now, very important is the fact that a large distinction between vocation and general education needed to be made to be included in the analysis, and this distinction was created by not only Handshake but Hanf and Wosman, those two papers, which then allowed me to pick my 7 countries from sort of that list they created. And then so looking at some of my summary statistics, the four most important, the rest of them are fairly boring. But first off is current employment of 72%. So this essentially means for my observable population, which was 6,600, that 72% of those individuals were employed. On the other side of that coin also means 28% of individuals were unemployed, which is a fairly high number, and why it was so important to take into account country-specific effects. Next, we have vocational education. So as you can see, 72.3% of my populace was vocationally educated in the last year. And then next you have mother's education and father's education are both nearing 2. Essentially what this means, 1 represents a below secondary international education, 2 is secondary, and 3 is a tertiary education. As you can see, both mother and father's education is nearing 2, so slightly below that of secondary education. All right, so the empirical results. My linear probability model, these are my results. Most importantly is my p greater than the absolute value of t. As you can see, I'm not included in here, but all but 2 of my variables were statistically significant at the 0.05 level. To go through the coefficients, actually let's start with signs first. My predicted signs were basically all incorrect, except for the most important, VET, interactive with age, was negative, and vocational education was positive. And essentially what this means, due to my limited dependent variable, is that, and this is also a dummy variable, vocational education of 0 and or 1, you are vocationally educated or you're not. Essentially this means if an individual is vocationally educated, they have it increases their employment by 25%. Whereas vocational education, if an individual receives a vocational education and increases their age by 1, they lose about 0.5% of employability. Now this may not seem like a lot, but if you add on 20 years onto that, it's about a 10% decrease in employment due to the fact of age interacting with vocational education. And this is exactly sort of in line with the theory, is while vocational education does grant initial benefits, as individuals increase with age, it decreases those benefits over time. Now for my counterfactual analysis. For starting with years of education, I wanted to include, actually let me explain it first. So 12, 13, and 14 is the educational attainment. So 12 years, 13, 14 years. And then you have my average, VET 0, essentially meaning general education, VET 1, vocational. And these numbers inside represent the employment within these, meeting these requirements. And so why I wanted to include this is the age-old theory, as you increase your education, your employment should increase. And so I wanted to make sure that my population was in line with this theory. And so as you can see, for a general as well as a vocational education, employment increases as years of education increase. Now more importantly is my counterfactual analysis with age brackets. So as you can see, starting at 25, I wanted to omit people younger than the age of 25 due to the fact that I think labor force participation under the age of 25 is not very high due to various reasons, as well as on the other end of the spectrum, 60 to 64, I omitted 65 because that's the last year of the surveying. So if we look at this in vocational education in gray, you see that it starts off far higher than a general education in employment. And up until age cohort 40 to 44, directly in line with the theory, is when general education crosses over into these benefits. So actually having a general education increases your employment up until we had a little blip in the 50 to 54 range, but we're back up. And so I think that's the most important and falls in line with my theory that vocational education increases employability in younger people, whereas general education increases employability as you grow in age. So my conclusions, as I just stated, my key findings is that vocational education grants initial benefits on employment over that of general education, but as individuals increase in age, general education then beats out. I've showed this through my results as well as my counterfactual. Now why this is important is I think it truly highlights the benefits associated with vocational education, and if it's true that vocational education does increase employability, there sort of needs to be something in place that mitigates the negative effects later in life. So it's not all positive that employability is increased, there's some negative in there as well. As for my model limitations, I had to run the linear probability model due to that linear probability model due to my limited dependent variable. Better models to run that with were the probit and logent model. For the sake of time and for my previous bank of knowledge, I was unable to run the logent and probit model. But when I ran them, I found that my signs were the same for the most important variables. So essentially, the logent and probit model can only extend my results. As for my potential for future analysis, one of the major questions I had right in the beginning was potentially these gains in vocational employment may lead to higher lifetime earnings over that of general education. So what the Hanishek, Schwartz, Wilson, and Zhang paper did, they looked at three different countries and tracked lifetime earnings for individuals with the education distinction. And what they found was a sort of a mixed bag. 2 out of the 3 countries, general education had enough time to beat out vocational education in lifetime earnings, but in one country, I can't remember the exact one, but vocational education, those initial gains on employment actually led to higher lifetime earnings. I think that's a very interesting topic and goes right back to the political debate. If vocational education does lead to all these benefits, I'm not quite sure why it's not really discussed. And that's the rest of my paper, or that's my presentation. Thank you. If you have any questions.
Yeah, I assume you included the US in your analysis or no?
The U.S. does not have that large of a distinction between vocational and general education compared to some of the other countries. A big tell was whether countries, sort of apprenticeship countries. So if we don't really offer apprenticeships here, and that was a big sign of vocational versus general education. So that was.
Did you include a dummy to see if that kind of system would be important?
Like an apprentice
Yeah.
system? I do not. No.
It's just something you might consider. I mean, it's, there are all sorts of issues with that,
Mhm.
but you might be interested in seeing if that's a significant coefficient or not.
Yeah, actually, yeah. A big issue I was running into though too is some of the, like the US, Germany, Australia omitted certain variables, and I was unable to use the US and Australia and some of those. I'm not sure why they omitted like specific ones like age, and the rest of it was open. And so turns out it's important to use age when tracking over a life cycle, so I wanted to.
Welcome to the world of data collection.
I have a question. If you were on an educational reform think tank and you were representing vocational education, are there 1 or 2 recommendations that come to mind that you would first voice?
Yeah, I just think I think it's, like I've said, I think it's interesting that vocational education is not really entered into the topic itself. Now, while vocational education does lead to higher employability, one of the issues that some of the papers raise is mobility is lacking in vocational education. So as individuals increase with age, it's not commonly what you would think is that it's because older people don't want to be on a job site or like working outside or something like that. It's more due to the fact that because they're trained in one occupation, their mobility is less. So I think it's, like I said, it's important to mitigate those mobility losses due to vocational education. So it's very happy to say that employment is so much higher than general education, but I think that mobility factor is very important, especially in older ages. Mobility is important to discuss. So I think that's the biggest issue I've raised with that. Yep.
Did any of your articles talk about well, as you were saying, like mobility in vocational education? Did they ever talk about like happiness in vocational education?
They don't. They kind of just equate money to happiness. So if you're making money, they say you're happy. I mean, that's basically all it was. They discussed mobility, but it was more theoretical discussions than actual empirical discussions. So I don't really have any hard evidence as to one way or the other.
In your graph, you had the distinction between vocational being more employable at the younger ages, and it lands out at about 45. Is that, I mean, do you have any evidence that that's just employers care less, or I mean, why do they come together and merge together at 45?
Well, actually, if we go all the way back here, the C. So essentially the reason why some of the arguments that it bridges is due to the fact that vocational education starts at this point, which is higher, whereas general education starts lower. So the C for general education is far higher. And then if we go to my VET times age. So slowly that sort of C decreases or as the C grows less, it increases the employability of the general education. So when you look at, the general education is more of a slope in the vocational education. It's just a starting out point is what the argument is. That's the main reason why general education is worse off in the in younger ages than older ages. I have to do that to answer your question. Slightly.
No, it does. One question too, that vocational learners don't learn
Yeah.
as quickly through time as general.
Yeah, that was actually, yeah. So my second article that I quoted in my literature discussed that the more education you have, the more on-the-job training you have. So the less people leave the workforce, and the less people leave their jobs, and the less they're actually searching for a job is due to the fact that the higher education you have, the more on-the-job training you have, so that employers have a higher stake in retaining you versus that of vocational education. But that was just one paper that I read, so it's not definitive that that's the answer.
Thank you.